Time for you to rethink.
You know the word annihilate? It means reduced to nothing.
Perished means killed.
We know what perished means.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Rethinking Hell Live, where evangelical Christians discuss what the Bible says about hell and put conventional and controversial views to the test. Join the discussion in YouTube's live chat or email your feedback, questions, and episode suggestions to live@rethinkinghell.com. Rethinking Hell is on Facebook as well, and be sure to check us out on Patreon if you'd like to become a supporter of the show. See the description below for all links and details, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for future updates.
Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Rethinking Hell Live. My name is Chris Date, and I've got a exciting interview lined up for you today. But before we jump into that interview, let me just remind you that if after this video is over, you like what you've seen, please do click that like icon under the YouTube video and subscribe to the channel so that we get greater exposure in the YouTube universe. Also, just a reminder, we are completely donation funded, at least for the time being. We don't have a store, we don't sell advertising space on our website or anything. Everything that we do, from this show to our annual conferences, all of that, we are heavily dependent upon your gracious support. So if you feel so convicted to give us a one-time or recurring donation of any size, please do consider going to rethinkinghell.com, clicking the PayPal button, or if patreon.com is your preferred donation medium of choice, you can also go to patreon.com/rethinkinghell. Let me introduce the interview guest that I've got lined up for you today. He is the professor of historical theology at Taylor Seminary, where he's taught since 2003. He's the author of several books, including Is the Atheist My Neighbor?, What on Earth Do We Know About Heaven?, and Finding God in the Shack, among others. He's also a philosopher, an apologist, and has published articles in leading academic journals like Philosophy Christi. I've forgotten what it's called. Philosophia Christi, I think is what it is. And Christian Scholars Review. His name is Randal Rauser, and he joins me to discuss conditional immortality, annihilationism, what may or may not be the differences between those two concepts, and what he thinks is the biggest challenge to annihilationism. Dr. Rauser, thank you so very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Before we dive into the reason why I wanted to talk to you today, I thought maybe we'd spend a few minutes getting to know you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're passionate about and why in terms of theology and philosophy, things like that.
So I've been at Taylor. This Taylor is not associated with Taylor University in Indiana. Just clarify, it's in Edmonton, Canada. It's a Baptist school. I've been here since 2003, and I love theology. I love apologetics too. And I think in the doctrine of hell in particular is one of those points where you have a nexus, a meeting of theology and apologetics, because of course many of the most difficult and challenging objections to Christianity are ones that are founded on some of the traditional views of posthumous judgment. So this became an issue for me of interest in '94 when I was in university, and I did a debate, and I was tasked with defending annihilationism, and that's when I kind of was won over by the strength of the argument. It wasn't simply a devil's advocate argument. So I can't say that I think a lot about the doctrine of hell, but it does come up quite regularly in my other interest, which certainly is apologetics and doing systematic theology that's engaged with a secular and skeptical culture.
You know, it's funny that you jumped right out of the bag saying that you're an annihilationist, because this video that you recently posted, and which we're going to talk about momentarily, I know that at least one person who watched that video came away thinking you were actually a believer in eternal torment, and that you were offering sort of the number one reason why you don't accept annihilationism. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about why you came to believe in annihilationism and what you see as its greatest strengths, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So go back to 1994. A couple books that were influential. Well, I was reading some of the stuff from Clark Pinnock at the time, reading John Stott, Philip Hughes. Those are just some of the voices that were beginning to become emergent when annihilationism was kind of emerging on the evangelical scene at that time. And the most significant of all of that time was Edward Fudge. So I read The Fire That Consumes, and that was one that was quite persuasive for me. In terms of arguments specifically, I think a couple of the arguments that I find most significant, I mean, apart from getting into the scriptural stuff, where I think there's certainly a very strong case to be made for annihilationism, simply in interpreting biblical passages, like what is Jesus actually talking about in Matthew 25? What is he talking with the sheep and the goats, I should say? Is it really eternal punishment and eternal life, or how else can we understand the term aionios that's used there? What about the destruction motif throughout Scripture? That's quite powerful for me. But I also think that some of the philosophical implications of eternal conscious torment are quite daunting when you really begin to unpack them. So, for example, I'll just give you one of them. On eternal conscious torment, you have to ask, well, then what is the relationship between the regenerate and the unregenerate eternally? And one of the popular views, certainly with the average person, is that, well, we are just unaware of what's going on in hell. And that's how you can have a heaven in which every tear has been wiped away, as it's described in Revelation 21, I think verse 4. The problem with that is, of course, it turns heaven into a charade, right? It's kind of like, I give this illustration. In fact, I just tweeted it again today. This illustration that heaven on that view becomes like going to a luxury resort where the only reason that you can have a good time is because there's a high enough retainer wall keeping out the misery of the slum next to you. And that just turns heaven into, I mean, that's not what Paul talks about. We will see face to face, right? Instead, in 1 Corinthians 13, instead, we're going to have a delusion, right? It's almost like being in the Matrix. So the other view, and this is really the more common view historically of how hell relates to heaven, the unregenerate to the regenerate, is to say that, well, heaven is enriched by the suffering of the damned. And so you find people like Tertullian or Thomas Aquinas, Jonathan Edwards, down to John Piper, arguing quite explicitly that the punishment visited upon the reprobate or those outside Christ eternally will magnify God's glory and his mercy for the regenerate. So what that means is that my daughter, God forbid, she should be lost forever, and I would be saved, that my enjoyment of paradise would be enriched by seeing her damnation and the contrast effect between the two. And what that does, see, the problem there is that I think that just suggests that to be fully like Christ is something completely different than what I think it is now. Yeah. Because what I think it is now is to have compassion and mercy for other people. And on that view, no, to be like Christ is to glory in the suffering of the damned forever because it magnifies God's glory. So I think when you really begin to think about that and the implications of it and the moral skepticism that results from that idea of sanctification, I think those are some strong reasons to really think hard about eternal conscious torment.
Yeah. It's interesting to sort of riff a little bit on what you just offered as a reason to doubt that historical answer to the question. I agree, we will be made like Christ and made like God in the eschaton to a degree that we have yet to attain. And it's not just the New Testament incarnate God who is described as compassionate in the way that you've just described, but it's also the Old Testament God who says, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. We can, at least I think I can imagine my loved ones, my unsaved loved ones dying finally and forever in hell. And there will be grief, there will be, I will miss them, but in time, I'll be able to move on, as I think all mourners do in time. But if my loved unbelieving ones were instead in some sort of torture chamber on some other side of the world or something like that, I'm going to be dropping everything I'm doing to try and do everything I can to rescue my child. At the very least, even if they're suffering justly, I'm still not going to be able to enjoy eternity in the way that I'm called to, precisely because I've been made like the God who takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would say that in some fairness to the advocate of infernalism or eternal conscious torment, that they also have many passages that they can turn to that talk about the wrath of God and so on. This, however, is really the tip of a very big hermeneutical iceberg. And I'll simply say that I'm of the school of thought that when we think about God, the lodestar or the plumb line or our lighthouse should be the way God is revealed to be in Jesus. Jesus says, if you've seen me to Philip, you've seen the Father. And so when we have problematic pictures of God in Scripture, such as God being seeming to be this sort of vindicative, wrathful, retributive being, the image that Ezekiel gives us in Ezekiel 16 is terrifying. Because in that picture, God raises Israel as a small child. He's like the father to the orphan. And then when she's old enough to enter into a romantic relationship, the metaphor switches and now he becomes her lover. So right there, that's just awkward. But then she's unfaithful. And then he calls together the nations and has her cut into pieces. And that is like the ultimate image of the terrifying, vindictive lover, right? Who kills and murders their unfaithful lover. And that's the way that God is depicted in Ezekiel. So, I mean, it's interesting that that's just 2 chapters away from Ezekiel 18:23 that you just referred to. So what we have to do sometimes is when I'm not sure what to do with some of these images, how to take them, the one thing I want to do is to go back, well, how's God revealed to be in Jesus? Or as Augustine said, paraphrasing here, but always read Scripture so as to increase love of God and neighbor. And neighbor being anyone, right? Not just the in-group. So that's just I'm not gonna settle all these issues here about the violent passages of God, but I agree with what you've said, that I think that we need to begin with God as revealed in Jesus and recognize those themes already there in seminal form in the Old Testament as well.
2 real quick additional questions before we dive into the main reason I had you on today. Firstly, as a Christian academic, as a professor, and as an apologist, have you caught any flack for becoming an annihilationist and remaining one? Is it something that has caused you difficulty in relationships or in professional contexts, anything like that?
The short answer is not really. Now, some of that has to do with context. So I am in Canada, and in Canada, we tend to be a little bit more progressive / liberal, however you want to put that. So some of the issues, let's say in some Baptist denominations, like the Southern Baptist, this would be a big thing in a Southern Baptist context. Not as much in my denomination, which is North American Baptist. So, for example, I've had a couple North American Baptist pastors, one of whom was very much an outspoken annihilationist, the other one who was quite sympathetic with the view. So I think that what you get in a congregational tradition like that is that you just have different churches where you have pastors that take a particular stance, and that contributes to the ethos of how the centering documents, in our case, the North American Baptist Statement of Belief, are interpreted, because it is a congregational tradition. So it's very much a bottom-up tradition as to how to read these documents and interpret them. And so that's been in the context in which I've been in, and it hasn't been so much of an issue. There obviously are people within the denomination and so on that would have a problem. But I think generally when we sit down and have a conversation, then I can at least get them to appreciate where I'm coming from. And I think it's very important as a general observation that when you do strike out on a somewhat novel theological position, it helps inestimably if people know who you are and they already trust you. Because then it becomes very difficult for them just to pigeonhole you as a liberal or whatever else, because they know who you are. Yeah. And so for me, the experience has typically been that when people find out my theological convictions on this issue, they already trust me, and that makes a big difference.
Yeah, that's a great answer. One last question then before we dive in. You've been teaching, as I said, at Taylor Seminary for nearly 20 years, and when I have active professors on this show and on the podcast, one of the things I like to do is give them an opportunity to sort of pitch their institution to prospective students. So if there are any viewers right now who are looking for a higher Christian education, why do you think they might like to consider Taylor?
Wow, I was not expecting that question, but as a good institutional company man, I'll say I'm always ready for that one. So Taylor Seminary, actually, it's interesting too to ask the question now, because we're just merging officially, and or I should say partnering, not merging, but partnering in a more intimate sense with our sister seminary, Sioux Falls Seminary in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And what is distinctive about us at this point is that we're adopting we have now adopted what's called the Kairos approach to education, where a degree is focused not on the completion of courses, but rather on the achievement of competencies. And so we have these 9 major competencies in the MDiv, and that's guided by mentoring teams when you register for the program. So you get a mentoring team, and the mentoring team guides you through the acquisition of competencies. So you can use traditional courses as one way to achieve the competencies, but you can also look at other innovative projects working with your mentor team to acquire competencies in other ways. And it's also then, it's because it's not a course-based program, it's rather a monthly subscription. I think it's $375 Canadian, and around that, or maybe a little less American. And it becomes actually a lot cheaper to do it that way if you work at a diligent pace. So I think it's a very innovative and exciting program to be a part of.
Awesome. Well, I hope that listeners will check that out, and I'll make sure in the description of this video to include links to Taylor Seminary and to yourself on the web as well, and I'll ask you for that link or links toward the end of the interview. Let's now shift gears and start talking about why I brought you onto the show. In a recent video that I mentioned earlier, in which you offer what you take to be the biggest problem with your view of hell and my view of hell, you also make an interesting distinction between terms that many of us who identify with both terms wouldn't recognize. And I'll explain what that is in a second, but maybe I could start by just asking you to lay out what you see as the distinction, or what should be seen as a distinction between conditional immortality and annihilationism, as you explained toward the beginning of that video.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is what's less important is what label we use. What is more important is the conceptual understanding we have behind the label. So one of the things that concerns me is that I do meet a lot of people who say that they are annihilationist, or they'll say conditional mortalist. And what their view is that when you die, if you're not in Christ, then you cease to exist, and that's the end of it. So for me, whatever the label you use at that point is less concerning than the fact that I think you've adopted a view that's inconsistent with what seems to me the clear teaching of Scripture, that there is a general resurrection, including the unrighteous.
Right.
So what I think that we should do is be clear that we should kind of distinguish between these positions. So my practice of distinguishing between conditional mortality and annihilationism is certainly, it's not particular to me. I've seen many other scholars do it. In fact, probably it was me reading Louis Berkhoff in the mid-1990s, his systematic theology, well-known Reformed theologian, where he makes that distinction as well. And so on this view, conditional mortality is the view that you would cease to exist when you die. I think Socinians, for example, or at least some Socinians have held that view among others. And then annihilationism is the view that there's that you don't cease to exist when you die, but rather you will be resurrected to a judgment, and then that judgment will be the means by which you cease to exist posthumously or after death. So I guess another way to put it is to think about conditional mortality as the minimal concept. You could say conditional mortality is simply the denial of the immortality or necessary immortality of the soul. And once you've adopted that, then you can say, okay, you might cease to exist when you die, or you might continue to exist for a general resurrection. And I think that you should adopt the latter view.
I certainly agree with that last part. I think if we do, to any degree, disagree, it will be on whether these terms, conditional immortality on the one hand and annihilationism on the other hand, are the way that distinction should be borne out. And the reason is because, firstly, and I'm just putting this out there to see what you think of it. I'm not trying to argue you into agreeing with me, although I'd be happy if you did. It seems to me, number one, that the conditionalist and annihilationist community within evangelicalism, and this stretches back all the way to the 19th century in America and Europe, that community, which affirms a general resurrection of the dead, self-identifies as both conditionalist and annihilationist. So number one, the distinction between these two, where one denies a resurrection and the other affirms it, that doesn't seem to be historically affirmed by the very people who self-identify with those labels. Secondly, when people do make a distinction between those two views, conditionalists and annihilationists, that is, usually they tend to see them as complementary rather than as mutually exclusive. So just as one example, you mentioned Clark Pinnock earlier. And he makes a really good, I think he explains it really well in his contribution to the first edition of Four Views on Hell. He says, my own position is a third possibility called annihilationism or conditional immortality. And in an article that he got published in Criswell, he says, conditional immortality is a necessary but not sufficient condition of my view. He says conditional immortality has to be true for a negative reason, namely to make the destruction of the wicked conceivable. But it does not positively establish annihilation simply because it would still be possible that God might give the wicked everlasting life and condemn them to spend it in everlasting torment. So the way I think Pinnock's right here, it seems to me that the phrase conditional immortality and the term annihilationism are like two sides of a coin. On the one side of the coin is a statement about who can receive immortality or whether everybody's immortal by default. And the other one is a question of what will happen to those who aren't finally immortal. And those seem to go hand in hand with one another. So I guess if I had my druthers, I would look for some different way of distinguishing between the view that the wicked are annihilated at death versus the view that they will one day be raised unto judgment and then annihilated. Just out of curiosity, how would you respond to any of that? And feel free to offer any thoughts at all.
Yeah, so first of all, there's the conceptual distinction that you've raised, well, like a matter of historical theology as to what has been common practice. The second issue is the conceptual one. So the historical question and then the conceptual one. I agree that that the description you have, let's say from Pinnock and others, has been observed and perhaps has been the mainstream view. I also have seen the other view, the other distinction between conditional immortality and that I was describing in Berkhoff and annihilationism. So for me, I'm happy to grant that that's the more common usage. And in fact, that's the usage I'm advocating as well. So as I was saying earlier, I think that what we should see is that annihilationism is a thesis that begins by accepting, well, that one of the things it requires is that you give up this notion that there's a necessarily immortal soul that cannot be destroyed. The minute that you give that up, then the possibility that the person ceases to exist after punishment is a live option. Although granted, it need not be a necessary option. God could still sustain in existence, if he wanted to, forever, by way of punishment, a person that he chose to. But of course, it becomes now a live option. So I'm fully happy to grant that. I think that is precisely the usage that you have, is the kind of usage that we should be encouraging. I am concerned that I do meet people who do confuse the issues, and so there are people who think of conditional immortality or annihilationism as simply ceasing to exist when you die. And so I think we should be clear on the view that we're advocating is one where there's a general resurrection. So again, so long as we're clear on the conceptual freight that our terms are carrying, then the terms that you use are of less interest to me than that we have a common understanding. But I agree with your proposed use of terms.
Cool. Well, what I will just say is I would encourage you, when in the event that you continue to distinguish between the views using these two phrases as the way of doing the distinguishing, I would encourage you to go back and check out Berkhoff, because if I'm not mistaken, and obviously here in our little short talk, I've only had time to skim what Berkhoff says in his systematic theology, but I don't actually see him making the distinction that you thought that you saw in Berkhoff. For example, he says on page 723 of a systematic theology that some of the forms of annihilationism and conditional immortality deny the resurrection of the ungodly, but he doesn't say that one does and the other doesn't. And he says earlier on pages 690 and 691, he treats them as more or less synonymous, or maybe as the two sides of the coin I was describing. So it could be, I'd just like to throw that out there as a possibility, that maybe Berkhoff doesn't distinguish between them in the way that you might have at first thought. Something to think about. But I will grant you this: there are those who have made a distinction, and it's interesting to me that those who do often don't agree with one another, and that's both amongst conditionalists or annihilationists and believers in eternal torment. So the terminology has been a sticky issue. We've been, for example, our community has sometimes been asking if there's a better term than either annihilationism or conditionalism to describe our views. So I'm not sure we're going to reach any sort of consensus anytime soon. Just out of curiosity, do you have any thoughts on that? For example, John Stackhouse, he prefers to call this view terminal punishment, and we at Rethinking Hell object to that way of putting it for reasons I won't get into here and now. But the point is, there's this thought amongst many of us that there should be a better label for our view. Do you have any thoughts on what that could be, or are you happy with one or the other that we've already got?
I do like the symmetry of isms, so that's why I like to call eternal conscious torment infernalism. I've seen that occasionally, not commonly used, but that has a nice parody there, so I like annihilationism. I also like the fact that you're like quoting Burkhoff and referring to him right after I referred to him. Do you know who Dwayne Gish is?
I don't.
Oh, okay. So Dwayne Gish was now this isn't there was this term, the Gish Gallop. So when he's a young creationist, well, he's not around anymore, but he would debate evolutionists, usually atheistic evolutionists. And then he would always kind of nail them with all this stuff, and it was called the Gish Gallop, where he'd have all this material. So you should have like the Chris Crunch. Wouldn't that be great?
Awesome. I'm gonna take you up on that. I'm gonna somehow work that in.
But yeah, I would say I'm happy with. I think we should just go with annihilationism. Recognize that conditional immortality is a general thesis that supports the additional thesis of resurrection and judgment that is captured in annihilationism.
Okay. For listeners or viewers who are interested, we've got a couple of articles at Rethinking Hell on why we think conditional immortality is indeed the better term. And I'll include links to that, and we can drop that at this point. But let's talk then about the heart of that video that I mentioned that you published, which is what you see as the biggest challenge to this view that you and I have, whatever we choose to call it. Can you lay that out for me and for viewers, what it is that you think is the biggest ethical and theological problem with annihilationism, regardless of whatever the biblical support might or might not be?
Yeah, so here the biggest sort of ethical or theological conundrum, it seems, is the fact that you have this idea of a resurrection to judgment. So if a person dies outside Christ, it's sort of like, okay, well, why not just let them cease to exist? But what actually happens is God goes about furnishing them with a resurrection body, only to have them destroyed at the end of a punishment of indeterminate period. Maybe it's a flash, or maybe it's for a longer period. He destroys them again. And so the question is, well, why would God, and presumably that's a terrifying experience, right? Like this, it seems one of the things that really bothers a lot of people in annihilationism is the idea of a purely retributive punishment. So it's sort of like, well, if people reject God and they don't want to have anything to do with him, and there's nothing else God can do, well, then he's left with that. But the idea of a punishment of pure retribution, an eye for an eye kind of deal, that seems to be that there's this ethical impulse against that. And there's certainly a reflection of that in many ideas today of Western jurisprudence, where we move from thinking about prisons as places of punishment to correctional institutes. Well, when you think about hell as annihilation, yeah, it's not eternal conscious torment, but it nonetheless is a resurrection that's only going to destroy a person again and perhaps subject them to terror as a process of that. And so it appears to be uncomfortably retributive. So it's not as bad, perhaps, as eternal conscious torment, but it nonetheless does raise a serious question as to why God would go about resurrecting people only to destroy them again. And maybe you can personalize it again. If it was my daughter who is resurrected to judgment, and I'm standing there in my resurrected state watching that, what a horrific scene that would be for me to see her brought back to life only to have God destroy her again.
So it would seem to you, at least on the surface, as if it would make a little more sense for God to simply let the dead lost be dead and remain that way forever, rather than bring them back to life for the purpose of destroying them again. Is that the gist of the challenge?
In essence, there was a documentary I saw some years ago called At the Death House Door, and it looks at the practice of capital punishment in the Walls Prison in Texas, and really at the fact of how dehumanizing killing people is. And then so it kind of focuses on the chaplain in the prison who, for 25, 30 years, his job was to keep people happy or like kind of moving day by day on death row until the last day when they're killed. And then he finally became very anti-death penalty. And there's one young woman who's interviewed in the film, and it was right after the guy who killed her father was executed. And they're asked, well, what did you think about that? And she said, he's dead, my dad's dead. That's just two dead people. And there's just something like in her mind, and of course other people disagree with this, but there's something, at least to her intuition, it's like, you're going to kill that person, you haven't actually changed or made anything better. And one of the impulses that really drives people away from eternal conscious torment is that God goes through all the trouble of resurrecting these people, giving them a resurrection body once again, bringing them back to life, giving them breath, only to kill them again. That's just more dead people. So from the objector, it just doesn't seem like there's a real moral necessity or theological necessity to this whole event.
At least in the way that you've just characterized it, though, I guess I don't see a difference between the objection to our view and the objection to eternal torment, because why would God resurrect the lost only to put them in prison for eternity? Can you tell us why you think that this objection is unique, or at least more has sharper teeth when it comes to our view than the traditional one?
Yeah, so, well, for one big reason, presumably, is that many people who do advocate for eternal conscious torment are committed to the necessary immortality of the soul. And so there's at least that already, that the person is going to continue to exist forever simply because of the metaphysical necessity of this kind of being or what they are. And of course, there are other additional justifications that people often use in eternal conscious torment, like the one I gave earlier, where they say that those who are resurrected to destruction manifest God's glory forever. And so he's most fully glorified before his creation because of the suffering of these creatures. It manifests his justice. And in the contrast effect, it manifests his mercy and grace to the elect. And so those can become overriding reasons to understand that there must be this, within the theological framework of eternal conscious torment, they don't seem to typically exist in the same way for those who are already drawn to annihilationist. And you could as well say that this also works in the favor of the universalist, who says, well, hey, you two guys are two peas in a pod, so why didn't you want to come over to universalism? The water's fine.
Okay, but what you just described, the reasoning that you offered as the traditionalist's advocate or the infernalist advocate, the reasoning that you just offered, it would seem to me applies even if the wicked dead remain dead and disembodied. I mean, if they've got immortal souls and if their ongoing punishing brings God greater glory, and for whatever other reasons, it seems like God could just allow the dead wicked to remain disembodied souls forever. So I'm still struggling to see how resurrection is uniquely a challenge for annihilationism in a way that it's not for traditionalism.
Well, let me put it this way, because when I was thinking about it, just today I devoted some time, I was saying to you earlier, about how an annihilationist would respond to this. And so one of the three responses, well, the first one was really two parts maybe. So one of them, though, is kind of related to that very idea. So the annihilationist... Let me take Romans 9, right? So in Romans 9, where it talks about, is it verse 28 or somewhere there, where the, or 22, 23, where it talks about objects of wrath created for destruction.
Yeah, 22.
And so, yeah, so then that's of course Calvinists often focus on that, and we should just be clear, and I'm sure your listeners are clear that Calvinism and Arminianism are just different topics than what we're talking about here. You can be one or the other and be any one of these views on posthumous judgment.
In fact, I think you and I, if I'm not mistaken, represent two different sides of that very thing, because I'm Calvinist and I don't think you are. So yeah, this is indeed something where people on any side of the soteriological debate can affirm this view of hell.
Yeah. So with that in mind, of course, the Calvinists traditionally, one way that they would interpret Romans 9, 22 and 23 is to say the objects of wrath prepare for destruction, that they interpret that at least in part, as a posthumous judgment. And so those people, one of the functions that they have is that they manifest God's glory to the elect, right? And you could argue that for the annihilationist as well as eternal conscious torment. So you could say, as an annihilationist, there is no significant difference here, because the eternal conscious torment or infernalist may say that this people eternally magnify God's justice, and we believe they magnify God's justice through an event. And so, yeah, you could kind of argue that way as a rejoinder from an annihilationist position.
But couldn't either of those answers be given even if the wicked were not raised, and if they just experienced their posthumous judgment before resurrection?
So again, the one distinction, though, is that the biggest distinction is the difference of immortality versus, or a necessary immortality versus conditional immortality. So the idea that God is sustaining this spirit to reunite that spirit with a soul in a particular unique way in order to destroy that individual again, versus the immortalist, that believes, well, no, God created a metaphysically simple substance that cannot exist. But yeah, just thinking about that, I'll just throw this out, and I'm sure you'd agree with me as well. There actually isn't that much of a difference there, because even if you believe souls are necessarily metaphysical beings, that they go on existing forever, that's not a constraint on omnipotence. God could destroy them if he wanted to.
Sure.
So even if the soul is a metaphysically simple substance that will go on existing forever, God is still sustaining it in existence in what we call divine preservation every moment, and God could withdraw that in any moment and it would cease to exist. So yeah, I'm not convinced that there is much of a difference there.
Yeah, well, and indeed, he wouldn't be God if that weren't the case. If we were somehow metaphysically necessary, and God didn't even have the power to destroy us, I don't see how we would be significantly different from God. But I suppose we can not spend any more time on that. I guess what I'll say, and I'm interested in the other reasons that you came up with as you were reflecting on this today. The reason why I keep asking about the resurrection specifically is because it seems to me that that the kinds of reasons we've been discussing so far for why God might raise the dead lost don't seem to actually distinguish between annihilationism and the traditional view, and they seem to be reasons that could perfectly well apply even in a disembodied state. Take the immortality of the soul, for example. If our souls are by the way that God has created them immortal, then that immortal soul or spirit could be punished posthumously forever without ever being resurrected, and so too could it be destroyed in the way that you and I think they will be without having first been resurrected. And so I'm still failing to see a distinction there. But what I will say is there does seem to be, at least on the surface of it, a unique challenge for us, because we think they're already dead, they're going to come back to life and then return to death again. Whereas the traditional view has them not yet, when they're raised, they'll remain that way forever. They're being raised so that they can be embodied forever, and we could get into the whys of that. But here's the thing, I want to push back on that and leverage an analogy that you offered in your video as the starting point for understanding why it is that God might raise the dead lost only to kill them again. And the analogy I'm talking about, if you'll recall, toward the end of your video, you said that it's kind of like someone who's critically injured and nursed back to health in a hospital, only to be taken before the firing squad and killed. But what's interesting to me is that if we just put a little bit more flesh on that analogy, I think it actually ends up working in our favor. So imagine, if you will, a man who is charged with a capital offense, like some sort of string of murders or something like that. And while he's in prison awaiting trial, he's stabbed nearly to death by a cellmate. Now, the justice system in this case doesn't just let this suspect die. It does everything in its power to save his life, even if there's just tons and tons of evidence pointing to his certain guilt. And it seems to me that this remains true even if the man has already been convicted. So even a convicted criminal who's in prison awaiting his capital punishment, if a cellmate tries to kill him, our justice system jumps through a lot of hoops to try and save that criminal's life, even though in what may only be weeks away, he's going to be marched down the Green Mile and strapped to the electric chair and killed or whatever. So I guess the first question I want to ask you is, do you think that this analogy, as I've shaped it, might in fact point to the possibility that this isn't as big of a problem as it might at first seem to be?
Yeah, the funny thing is that that's actually precisely what I was writing up in my first response this afternoon.
Okay.
So let me just say some stuff that'll just complement everything you just said.
I love that.
So
please do.
First of all, I was like getting a tire. I went out to Costco today to get a tire swap. So I was gonna switch back to summer tires. So I paid $40 and then dropped the car off. And then they call me back and they say, okay, actually, your summer tires are just too bald. You really should get new tires. I'm like, yeah, okay. I was hoping to get another year out of them, but fair enough. So then he says, well, we'll refund you this, and then we'll put through the new charge. Now I'm thinking, it would just be easier to take $40 off the final charge. Except I recognize that the proper way to run a business is, okay, if I'm not going to be charged for that, if I'm not going to get that service, then yeah, you remunerate me, you pay me back, and then you charge me for the service I actually get. Now that's a step into this much bigger issue that you're just talking about. So man's committed murder, he's tried, convicted, he gets, and I actually wrote this out, he's on death row and he gets in a fight with another guy. He's critically ill, he's minutes away from death. They nonetheless take him to the prison hospital and they allow him to recover. And then yes, he will maybe end up with capital punishment later on. But the point being, it's not proper for him to die because he was in a prison fight. Reason for him to die would be because of the proper punishment. And so by analogy, it wouldn't be enough for a person to die, to cease to exist simply due to their Adamic mortality, their physical death, but there has to be a proper spiritual death that is a result of that, and that would come through the general resurrection. So I think that we're on the same page on that.
Well, that's great to hear. But I have a couple of additional things I'd like to suggest that apply more to the first way I shaped the analogy, which is the person has not yet been convicted and they're awaiting trial. And in prison while awaiting trial, they're stabbed and the justice system jumps through hoops to try and save their life. That analogy seems to me to point toward the concept of a fair trial. And when I talk about a fair trial, I don't just mean fair to the defendant, to the accused, but I mean fair to the victims and their families of the suspected criminal. So it seems to me that one reason why somebody who's awaiting trial and is stabbed in prison is going to have his life saved, even though there may be tons and tons of evidence against him and nobody doubts his guilt. The one big reason, nevertheless, why the justice system might keep that person alive and make sure they get to have a trial is because I think many of us, if not most of us, intuit that a fair trial requires that the accused have an opportunity to defend him or herself. And what's more, it seems to me that witnesses and victims and victims' loved ones want the opportunity to speak into the case with their own testimony and even possibly witness justice being done, the sentence being declared. Do you think that this idea of the concept of a fair trial, fair to both the accused and to the people that they've victimized, do you think that might be one reason why the dead lost God may decide to bring them back to life so that they can have this kind of fair trial, especially if anthropological dualism is true and human beings are not complete human beings as they're designed to be if they're disembodied. It's sort of like a half-life, right? It's not really what human beings are designed to be. So God brings them back to life so they can stand a fair trial as embodied whole persons the way that God has designed us to be. Do you think there might be something to that?
Yeah, in fact, when I first did my version of the analogy, it actually does happen before the fellow is convicted. Now, the reason I put it after his conviction is because, of course, every analogy is a compromise at some point, yeah. Right? And so in this case, it's a recognition of, you could say Hebrews 9:27, after death there is judgment, that there is in a traditional view, unless you have a second chance theology, which I'd like to talk about later, but on a traditional view, you're sort of the die is cast, your will is set at the point of death. Then in a sense, the general resurrection judgment is a ratification of the fact that you're already going to, Sheol or to Abraham's bosom or something in this intermediate state, that there's already a place that you're going. You're already on death row at that point. So so that's why I was putting it there. But and so another thing I would say in terms of framing it the way you did is to recognize that the metaphor of the courtroom breaks down to some degree when there's already the judgment has been decided, right? There's actually no deliberation involved in this divine court. It's simply a manifestation or a revelation of that judgment which God has already rendered on the person. And there's no chance, for example, that they're going to be exonerated or that they're going to get a reduced sentence. And so at that point, at those points, it breaks down. Where I think your analogy is very helpful is in recognizing that the process of having, let's say, the people who have been, like, imagine Hitler, right? There's an obvious example. Having those victims of Hitler have an opportunity to speak. In Canada, we had, I'm just trying to think of the term for it now, because we had a history of residential schools where it was a cultural genocide, where Indigenous people were removed from their homes and were put up in these residential schools in order to destroy their culture. And so it was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's been going on for like 10 years now. I don't know if they're still meeting, but they would meet and they'd give people the opportunity to talk about how they had been victimized and abused and so on, and recognizing the importance of having that opportunity. And you can think about hell in part as, the general resurrection to judgment as a manifestation of something like that, but on a cosmic scale. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't my idea. We've got an article written by a fellow contributor to Rethinking Hell named Joey Deere called Double Jeopardy, and it's this concept of dying and then rising to die again. And this is one of the reasons that he offers why God might do that, is so that the victims and their loved ones can have an opportunity to speak into the case. So he'll be encouraged to hear that you think that he's onto something there. In the thinking that you've done today on the topic, were there any other reasons that maybe we haven't yet discussed why God might choose to raise the dead lost if ultimately he's going to destroy them? Or have we covered them all?
Well, I did think of one other one that requires a person to accept several claims, but I think it's to me, it was an interesting novel possibility. So it does require a commitment to three things: holistic dualism, open theism, and a second chance theology. And I'll say I'm not an open theist, but if you did hold to these three claims, then you'd have, I think, a novel reason, an interesting reason for why there would be hell. So holistic dualism here, the point being that you have a limited cognitive function, I think, as you alluded to earlier, when you're not embodied, right? As you may continue to exist as a soul, you may have some sensory input, maybe some limited cognitive function, but you're not what you are when you are embodied. Open theism, meaning that God doesn't know the future free contingent decisions of creatures. And second chance theology here being the idea that some people don't get a proper opportunity to accept the gospel or enter into a saving relationship with Christ in this life. And because he is omnibenevolent and desires to save all, he will afford them that opportunity in the next life. So in other words, in a general resurrection. So in that context, the idea of a general resurrection would be this: that people cannot make a fully informed decision of how to be reconciled or whether to be reconciled with Christ until they've been holistically resurrected to life once again. At that point, they have the opportunity for a second chance to enter into a relationship with Christ, and it's possible on that view that some may and others would not. Now, of course, the question is, well, why would God resurrect everyone for a second chance only to destroy some and not others, right? And allow the others actually to enter into Christ because they never had that opportunity in this life. And that's where open theism comes in, because the open theist would say, well, God didn't know which of those people ultimately would decide when they had the full opportunity as a resurrected being to encounter Christ and to have that opportunity. And so he resurrects all of them, and the subset that enter into a relationship with him now can do so, and the rest are destroyed. And so that's, I think, a novel. I haven't encountered it before. Not that I've frankly read a lot in this area, but I think it's an interesting possibility. It's not open to me because I'm not an open theist, but if somebody was, then they might want to consider it.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's triply not available to me. I'm not a dualist, I'm not an open theist, and I'm not somebody who believes in second chances after death. But what I will say is, I'm not yet convinced that the open theism part of that triad is in fact necessary for this answer to gain traction, because right now, even if Arminianism or Calvinism is true, God right now is permitting countless millions of people to experience long, healthy, embodied lives, even though he knows with certainty, if indeed he hasn't ordained it, because I'm a Calvinist, that they're ultimately going to reject Christ and die. He could just take them out right now if he wanted to. It doesn't seem to me as if open theism is necessary to explain why God might raise the dead to give them a second chance he knows many of them won't in fact accept. Do you think that might be the case, or do you think that maybe that I'm maybe overlooking something or not taking seriously enough the idea?
Well, I'll say that the open theist view would be consistent with universalism. So God ultimately, on the open theist view, wouldn't know if everyone will not respond favorably, and perhaps everybody will respond favorably once they have the opportunity to encounter Christ fully. So it's at that point that a person that availed themselves of this option could also say that they're a hopeful universalist, and that perhaps God resurrects everyone with the hope that all will ultimately be reconciled to Christ, and if not, then he'll destroy whoever will not be, or he'll withdraw life from them, or however you want to think about it.
Well, that's interesting stuff. Like I said, that's not available to me as somebody who's not an open theist, and neither of those other things either. But it does seem to me as if we've discussed some plausible reasons that might explain why God would raise the dead, even though they're ultimately going to be found guilty and destroyed. So I appreciate that. Do you, after having given it this thought and having discussed it in this interview, do you still think it's much of a challenge to annihilationism, or do you still think it's the biggest, it's just not very big? Or, what would you say if you could do a follow-up to that video now?
Oh, well, I never thought it would, to me, it wasn't something that kept me up at night. I think that it's the strongest that I've come up with. That's part of my practice of trying to steel man objections, so present the objections to my view in as strong a form as possible. I once, I've moderated one debate a couple of years ago, actually with Andy Bannister, the well-known Christian apologist and then an atheist, and then somebody afterwards came up to me and said, "Are you a theist or an atheist? Because I couldn't tell from your debate moderation." And that's the best compliment I could have had.
Yeah.
And so when you said that your friend thought I was an infernalist or supported eternal conscious torment, I actually take that as something of a compliment, because I want to try to steel man objections as best I can. And if I haven't done as good a job here, I'd invite my friends who are advocates of the view to rework my objection and respond to the counter rebuttals that you and I have both offered today. So yeah, I wasn't overly persuaded by it. I still think probably it's one of the stronger, if not the strongest, theological objections that I've thought about, but that doesn't make it overly strong in my view.
Sure. Yeah, I feel the same way. Before we wrap things up, this is not something I had intended to ask you about, but since we've got a few more minutes before the end of the hour, I thought maybe I'd mention it. In the video that we've been discussing, toward the beginning of it, you mentioned that this isn't at all a new view of personal eschatology, and you mentioned Arnobius, and even a couple of hundred years prior to him was Irenaeus of Lyon, who seems to have held our view. But I want to, since you're a professor of historical theology, I'd love for you in your spare time, should you have some, to watch a few videos in this YouTube channel, the Rethinking Hell YouTube channel, where I've recently been attempting to make the case that Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, and the writer of the Epistle of Barnabas, to name just a few of the apostolic fathers, were also held to our view. That might be particularly interesting to you as a historical theologian, and it might give you further historical ammunition in defense of the view. And I'd love to hear what your take on those videos turns out to be, if you could find the time. Definitely. Yeah, I'd like to do that. And can I ask you, because you said that you're not an advocate of second chance theology, so what would you say about for example, the 12-year-old Jewish girl who dies at Auschwitz? And she rejects Christianity, but the Christianity she rejects is the one of the hooked cross of the swastika. Yeah. Well, obviously, we're no matter how I answer this, I'm probably not going to change your mind or anybody else's. So obviously, I'm just answering the question, not trying to marshal an argument here. But it seems to me that we as Christians make a mistake when we treat the punishment of hell as being the punishment owed to those who reject Christ. The punishment awaiting people in hell is not what we deserve because we reject Christ, it seems to me. Accepting Christ would have exonerated us. It would have been what grants us pardon. But it's not, here's an analogy going back to this issue of capital punishment in the justice system. If 10 people are on death row awaiting execution, and the governor issues a pardon to some of them, it's not as if the others are going and being punished because they didn't get a pardon. They're punished because of the crimes they committed. Now, now to apply the analogy to the real life, it seems to me that even the 12-year-old girl who suffers in Auschwitz and even dies there may not have ever been presented with a genuine opportunity to accept Christ, but that doesn't mean that they're not sinners deserving of death. And as such, it seems to me that it's perfectly legitimate, perfectly just to raise that person and try them and ultimately punish them for their sin, not simply because they rejected a view that they were never really given an opportunity to accept in the first place.
And you'd say that with a 6-year-old?
Yeah, I don't believe that there is an agent of accountability. I have raised 4 sons, or am raising 4 sons. My oldest is 18, my youngest is 6. And even when our oldest now child was even very, very, very young, less than 6 years old, it became very clear to my wife and me that human beings are not born good. We're not even born neutral. It seems to me that even the youngest children are extremely selfish, self-absorbed, disobedient, rebellious. I love them to death. Don't get me wrong, and I think that my children are relatively much better behaved than a lot of children I've met, but they're nevertheless inherently sinful from birth, or so it seems to me. So yeah, I think I would comfortably say. Now, I will say this: I'm not convinced that a 6-year-old who dies and then is raised will face judgment as a 6-year-old, right? I don't know how resurrection is going to work, and whether people who die at a very young age will be given adult resurrection bodies and minds. I don't know how any of that will work, but it doesn't seem to me that being 6 years old absolves somebody from their sin.
Okay, so does that? Let me put it this way: that in around the world in jurisprudence, it's sort of recognized that we don't execute children, let alone put them to life sentences, because a couple reasons. Their brain development is such that they cannot anticipate consequences, and they lack impulse control that is occupied, or that people who are adults have achieved, and that affects their understanding of jurisprudence. That's why two reasons we don't kill children. But you think that that doesn't apply when it comes to posthumous judgment, and the stakes are inestimably higher than because they are being judged ultimately by where they like if they die when they're 6 years old or 12 years old, they're judged by a brain that lacked the impulse control and the ability to anticipate consequences of a 6 or 12-year-old.
Sure, but I don't think that the human justice systems or the human governments punish people, or let me put it another way. Human governments, it seems to me, punish people for the specific crimes that they are alleged to have committed and convicted for having committed. Whereas the punishment of hell seems to me to be more than just that. It's not merely a punishment for sins X, Y, and Z. It's a punishment for who a person is. And as such, yes, a 6-year-old doesn't have as developed a brain or mind as somebody who's 12 or an adult, but they nevertheless are sinful from conception, it seems to me, not only from my own personal experience as a father, but also just based on biblical passages like, David saying in the Psalms that I was knit in sin in my mother's womb. We have Paul saying in Romans 5 that between Adam and Moses, when there was no law to break, everybody still died as evidence that they were guilty in Adam. So it seems to me that the both experience and the biblical witness is to the idea that human beings from conception aren't just committing individual cosmic crimes. They're innately cosmically criminal. And I think that adds a layer of accountability, a layer to the judgment that we don't see in human justice systems. Nobody's punished for being a certain way in our governments, in our justice systems. We're punished for doing certain things.
Well, I'm glad that I thought we were agreeing too much today, so I'm glad that we ended on some significant disagreements.
Well, and this is the great thing, and I say this very often to people. Just like any view, conditionalism or annihilationism is not monolithic, and what's amazing to me about conditional immortality or annihilationism or whatever other label you want to use, if you're John Stackhouse or Douglas Jacoby, you might prefer the phrase terminal punishment, but whatever you call it, what amazes me is how consistently a person can hold to it regardless of whatever other commitments they have in other disputed areas of Christian theology. So you and I are a Calvinist and a non-Calvinist sharing this view. One of us has no problem with the idea of the dead loss not getting a second chance. The other does think that there's something to be dealt with there. There are cessationists and continuationists. There are premillennialists and there are amillennialists like me, and on it goes. Every single one of these sort of intramural Christian debates, you can be a conditionalist and fall on any side of any of those debates. And I think that speaks to the strength of this view, is that somebody who holds to any of these different commitments can still see the biblical and theological strength of this view and accept it without having to give up any of their commitments in any other area of Christian theology. That strikes me as making for a very strong eschatological position.
Yeah, I think it's something analogically like the same engine can be in many different models of car, right? And so you just have to make the appropriate adjustments in order to put that same engine into a pickup truck or into a sports car or something else. You may have to adjust the calibration here and there, change horsepower ratings, boost the torque or something else, but you can put that same engine into several different vehicles, and you can put the same theological claims, such as annihilationism, into various different theologies. So long as you make appropriate adjustments so that you connect everything and it's working right.
That's right.
It's just to avoid that what some people have, the cognitive dissonance, right? Where, I'm sure, where they haven't connected everything, and so they don't have a working theological system.
Yeah, no, very, very good. Well, listen, I want to give listener or viewers the opportunity to check your work out and find you online. Where do you recommend people to go if they want to look up what you've written, look at some of your ministry, and maybe even contact you by some means?
Well, randalrauser.com is my website, so you can look me up there. RandalRauser.com. That's where I blog. I've got a couple hundred movie and book reviews there. I've got about 2,500 articles and links to, I've written 11 books, co-written 3 and written 8, and several other things. A lot of stuff there, so you can check me out there.
Good. Well, I hope viewers will do that, and I hope that they've enjoyed the interview. I know I have. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris. It's been great.
So that's all I've got for you today, and thank you for joining us. Again, if you liked the interview, if you liked the video, please do click that like button and subscribe to the channel. One-time or recurring donations are a big help as well, and I hope that you will join us for the next episode of Rethinking Hell Live. Until then.
Man, look, maybe we should rethink this whole thing. I mean, you heard the guy.
Pains of eternal torment.
Yeah, I gotta rethink this whole thing.